So what do we mean by labor relations? Labor relations is a term that refers to the interactions between labor and management, workers and managers, that involves some form of collective representation and often collective action. So sometimes people use the word labor management relations. They mean the same thing as labor relations. Sometimes you may hear the term industrial relations. That also refers to the same set of issues I'm talking about. I just happen to like the phrase labor relations, but what I mean are the interactions between labor, workers, or sometimes people call them employees, employees and managers. Now traditionally, the form that collective representation takes, group or collective action takes, is through trade unions. But as you'll hear about in my remarks, if you are not aware already, increasingly collective action is taken by non-governmental organizations, what are labeled as NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and also by a variety of rights groups, trying to further and advance the rights of those workers or employees that they represent. The last just sort of definitional matter that I want to clarify is that in my view and the view of nearly everyone who studies labor relations and people who practice labor relations, whether they be on the management side or the labor side, is that much of what labor relations is about the exercise of power, the development of power by one side or the other, the use of power by one side or the other. And that's what much of labor relations is concerned with. Now, as I'll go on to explain, that doesn't mean that all of labor relations is necessarily win-lose. One party is gaining and the other is losing. It's not all about a fight, even though one recognizes that power is the central dynamic that's often motivating, driving, and determining the course of labor relations. I teach labor relations at Cornell University. I teach it an introductory course to 19-year-old or 20-year-old sophomores, and they hear me say over and over in that course that if you understand what power is about, where it comes from, how the parties are choosing to exercise it, how they're seeking to gain power, then you understand labor relations. I say it so often they get sick of me repeating that term. So keep that in your mind. As we talk about developments across the globe, much of this is really about developments that influence the power of either workers or managers as they interact. Okay, as I said, my remarks will basically draw from, essentially I'm going to just outline the key points made in a book I recently authored with two colleagues. I brought a sample. It was only written last year, so I still feel really good about the book actually getting published. You know, we academics, we work on books for years and years and years and years, then they get published, and usually only a few people ever read them. And so when you got to really celebrate when the book actually gets published. So you just have to bear with me. This is the book. It's called, thank you. It's the same title as the talk, Labor Relations in a Globalizing World. And I should acknowledge it was written by three of us, three authors, myself, my colleagues, Thomas Koken and Alexander Colvin. Thomas Koken is a renowned professor at MIT. Alex Colvin, like myself, teaches at Cornell. The book was published last year by Cornell University Press, and it focuses on, as I've mentioned before, emerging countries. Okay, let me diverge a bit and just tell a few little stories about how the book came about and also what we mean by the word emerging, how we chose that word. So, true story, the reason this book came about is that the three of us, Tom, Alex, and myself, have written a textbook about labor relations in the United States. It's actually gone through 4 editions, and we use it, and some other people use it, mostly in the United States, to teach labor relations. Often to undergraduates, it often is sometimes, I should say, it's sometimes used for graduate student teaching, and some people who practice out in the field or engaged in work as managers or unionists either take courses with this book or refer to it. So in any case, I, for 9 years, was the dean of the Labor Relations School at Cornell, and in that role, I was trying to develop a closer relationship between my school, the Labor Relations School at Cornell, and a university in China. We were trying to learn more about China, have our students have the opportunity to study in China, to have exchanges where faculty from China would come to our school, and we'd get to know each other better and learn more about our different systems. So I think it was 3 or maybe 4 years ago, I was at Renmin University in Beijing in China, where we were developing an exchange program, this relationship. And they asked me to give a lecture while I was there, kind of like this, and I was babbling on, talking on about my research. I finished my lecture, and a woman came up to me with her hand behind her back and said, "Professor Katz, Dean Katz, do you remember me?" And like I often struggled with as a dean, I looked at her puzzling, trying to remember who she was. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't remember who you are." And she said, "Well, I visited your school 3 years before, and you were kind enough to let me sit in audit in your class. And voila," she said, "I loved your class so much, and the textbook that you used, that we translated your textbook." She gave me a book that was a word-for-word translation of our textbook. And again, the textbook was about labor relations in the United States. So on the one hand, I felt really proud. I was tempted then to ask for a cell phone so I could call my mother and tell her that people in China were going to read my textbook. But when I thought about it more, I decided that was actually sort of a crazy thing for them to do, because as you may know, labor relations, think about how workers and managers interact in Ecuador. The law is different in Ecuador from what it is in the United States. The power situation is different in Ecuador between workers and managers. Your industries are different. Your history is different. The same thing is true between the United States and China. You know, we have extremely different labor relations. So I ended up thinking that it was really a little crazy for them to be relying on a textbook about U.S. labor relations to try and and learn about labor relations in China, right? So I went back, I talked with my colleagues, and we decided to write a different book, a book that was about labor relations in emerging countries. So the book is focused on emerging countries, including China, but including other emerging countries as well. So let me then explain the word emerging countries. Ecuador I would include in the category of emerging countries. We first called these countries developing countries. So we thought, okay, we'd call the book Labor Relations in Developing Countries. But there were two problems with that. Is some people said to us, that sounds a little arrogant, you know, as if the United States and Western Europe, those are advanced countries, and these other countries, including your own, but also China and India and others, they're somehow inferior. They're less developed. So we thought about that and decided, yeah, well, maybe we shouldn't use that word. Maybe people would be insulted or misinterpret our meaning in those countries. And then we thought about the fact that the reason we were writing this book was because labor relations was in transition, was changing in those countries we were examining. And so we looked for a word to capture kind of the transition, and we came up with the phrase emergence. So we think of what's happening in the developing world on the labor side as a set of changes that are heavily influenced by globalization, but are very much in transition. The other issue we recognized is your country, like China, India, and many of the other countries that are sometimes called developing, or we call them emerging, are actually pretty developed. You have sophisticated economies, you have sophisticated industry, and so the other thing we wanted to emphasize with the word emerging was, again, the notion that labor relations was emerging, even though your economies may well be fairly advanced. And actually the level of advancement across all different economies differs much, and it's too simple to think of them being either advanced or unadvanced or advanced and developing. So in any case, I'm sorry for that diversion, but that explains our use of the word emerging. Now, there's many, many countries where labor relations is emerging, and we couldn't cover them all in much depth in one book. So we chose to focus on these four countries with case studies, countries, some of which I've mentioned: China, India, Braille, I couldn't spell, Brazil, I couldn't type, Brazil, and South Africa. Some people call them the BRICS, except we didn't have Russia in there. Why did we choose those four for kind of intensive analysis in our book? For one reason, those four are large economies, big countries with a lot of economic activity, but also we like them as our case studies because they're illustrative. They provide good illustrations, good examples of what we believe is happening across the globe. I wish, anticipating that I would be invited to this conference, that maybe I would have had some material on Ecuador in this book, but we don't have material about Ecuador. Neither I nor Tom or Alex were experts on Ecuador. Maybe in the next edition we'll have Ecuador in the book. So let me just mention some other things about the book, and I'll go on to explain them in more detail in my remarks. One of the things we wanted to do was rely on what we knew and know about labor relations from our previous research and from others' research in a variety of countries. So we want to draw on, as I refer to in the slide in point 5, we want to draw on various lessons. Sort of what do we already know about labor relations that it seems to apply in many countries. And then again, the last point I'll say over and over, we're focusing in particular, as it says in the title of the book, on the consequences of globalization. What difference is globalization making to the conduct of labor relations? Or another way to think about this is, what difference is globalization making to the power relationship between labor and management? So first, let me mention some of those labor relations lessons, things we all know, those of us who study and work in this field. What do we already know that we've learned from the course of history across many countries regarding the relationship between workers and their representatives and management? As I've already said, I'm one of those who believes, and this book argues, once again, that power matters. If there's any one thing you have to be thinking about in the domain of labor relations, is who has the power, or who has more power relative to the other party? How is power changing? How are some action that one side would take, labor would take, or management would take, how is that going to influence their power relative to each other? As we study power, we and those in this field, parties who act as either laborers or labor's representatives or managers, realize that the sources of power are either economic or political. Both economic and political factors matter. In this sort of talk, I don't have the time to go on into all the details about how the macroeconomic economy, for example, affects the power of workers on the shop floor, or how are workers and unions' ability to gather political leverage affects the course of labor relations. But what I can say and remind you of is that power is influenced both by economic and political factors. The other central lesson of labor relations is that it's mixed motive. That's a phrase we all use, who study this subject, use to describe labor relations. What do we mean by mixed motive? We mean that there are both distributive issues and integrative issues involved in labor relations. Distributive issues are issues about distribution, about who gets what share of the profits or income of an enterprise. Those are win-lose issues, right? If the workers get a larger share of the profits of the firm, management and the owners get a lower share. In that sense, they're about distribution, right? And we think of wages and the pace of work, for example, as distributive. Pace of work. Workers would, at a simple level, like to work slower. Management would like them to work faster. Okay? Again, a distributive issue. But at the same time that there are distributive issues, there are also what are called integrative issues. Integrative issues are issues or aspects of the relationship at work that can increase the profits and income of the firm. And we often think about technological change as an example of an integrative issue. The parties can agree on ways to introduce new technology, and that expands the amount of profits and income at the firm. The parties can also find ways to improve the way work is carried out. Work rules and work processes can be made more efficient. A lot of what labor relations is about is an attempt to find ways to increase the efficiency of the enterprise, and at least potentially those efficiencies may be win-win issues, integrative issues. Now, what makes labor relations both complex for the parties involved in it, but I also think interesting for those of us who study it, is the recognition that there are both distributive and integrative issues going on at the same time, right? And the point would be, suppose you adopt a new technology that increases the productivity and the profits and income of the firm. Well, you're immediately presented with a question of distribution. Well, who gets the benefit of that expansion in productivity, that increase in productivity, that increase in profits or income? So it's naive to think that you can separate completely distributive from integrative issues. Another point to make, and again, this is a bit of a simplification, but bear with me, I hope it just helps you think through these matters, is a Marxist position, sometimes called a radical position, believes that everything in labor relations is essentially distributive. It's all about distribution, right? Who gets the profits, workers or managers? At the same time, there are some people in the field of management, they were historically referred to as the human relations school in management. They believed that everything was integrative, that there was a potential for gain for everybody. It was just a question of getting workers to recognize that they were in the same, they had the same interests as management, that everything is win-win. Those of us in the field of labor relations think both extremes are wrong. Both of those philosophies, again, I've oversimplified them, but both of those views are wrong. That labor relations is neither all about distribution, it's not all win-lose, nor is it all win-win. It, in fact, is a complex interaction between distributive and integrative issues. And again, that explains more about why the parties' interactions are so complex and at times so difficult, is because there are both things going on. Okay. The last traditional lesson that I want to mention from labor relations is that due process matters at the workplace and more broadly in society. What I mean by that is workers care about whether they have voice. They care about whether their complaints and their concerns at work are expressed, are heard, and they also care more broadly about whether their interests are represented in society and in the broader political processes that guide a society. And labor relations is in part about the question of how and to what extent there will be due process. Okay. As I said, this book is about labor relations in emerging countries, and the question now I want to focus on is what's special, what's particular about how labor and management interact in emerging countries. The first point, and you can see it here in Ecuador, is that the informal sector is large. The formal sector is large enterprise, large bureaucracies, large firms, whether they be in the public sector or private. They're a relatively small share of employment in many emerging countries. Some people had hoped and dreamed that the informal sector would shrink rapidly and be gone by now. And one of the interesting features of modernization actually has been that the informal sector has actually not shrunk, and there's even some evidence that it's growing. Informal means, again, the lack of kind of structured firms, structured employment relationships. People selling goods on the street, people working in the family and enterprise, people working by themselves in a contract relationship with a larger entity. They often operate in this informal sector. And yet, even in that informal sector, as I'll mention a bit more later, there is a growing influence of collective representation. That's an interesting phenomenon. In the past, we didn't see much collective representation in the informal sector, and now we see at least some of it. Another particular issue in emerging countries is labor relations are highly political, even more political than they are in more, quote, advanced economies. A third point I'll talk a lot about is that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are important and growing in influence in emerging countries. They're often the vehicle through which there's collective representation and collective action. Although historically we all thought the vehicle was going to be trade unions, it's often now more commonly NGOs that are promoting the interests of workers in society. Where there are unions in emerging countries, they tend to be in the public sector, representing government employees, telecommunication, mining, refining, transportation. When those firms are part of the public sector, there you typically see unions. And in some countries, if unions exist at all, they only exist in the public sector, and they're almost non-existent in the private sector. I think that's true in Ecuador as well. Is that right? You have unions representing not necessarily all, but some of the public employees. And my sense is, although again I'm not an expert, you have very few unions representing employees in the private sector. In a few cases, but not as common as exists in the public sector. That's wrong or just not existent? Okay. Okay, we'll talk later. I'd like to learn. Another key issue for emerging countries, although it's not just for emerging countries, but it's particularly important for them, is that multinational corporations, MNCs, and global supply chains are really important. They're critical. I'll have more to say about them. Another interesting point is where there are unions, increasingly in emerging countries, we see the importance of independent unions rather than the state-dominated unions that had existed in the past. And in some cases, these unions are still in competition with one another. In Mexico, for example, you see both state-dominated unions, unions sanctioned by the national government or the party in power, but there also is a growth of independent unions. Independent in the sense that they're independent of a connection to the major political party or the government itself. And independent unions are becoming more active, more important. I'll just jump ahead. As an example, in China, one of the key questions is whether we will see the rise of independent unions. We see the rise in China of collective action, workers going on strike. You may have read about this, and defying the wishes of the unions that exist in those firms, unions in China. The only official unions, the unions that are allowed, are affiliated with the Communist Party. They're an example of a government-dominated union. And the question for China will be whether we'll see the strike action that's appearing in many parts of China coalesce and take the form of action by more independent unions, or whether the state unions will somehow change. Or anyway, that's a key question. And then last but not least is that labor rights issues are increasingly important. The question of what the conditions are, what the rights are of workers working in garment factories, in other consumer good factories, all kinds of issues that surface now. Again, there's much publicity about that. In China, questions about the rights of workers in the factories that make iPhones, questions about the rights of workers who work in garment industries in China and other emerging countries. Okay, so the other focus of this book, as I've said, is not just on emerging countries, it's asking the question of how globalization is affecting labor management relationships. Again, I've already mentioned it, but I want to highlight it again. There's a very important role for multinational corporations. They've expanded. That's part of what globalization entails. It involves more trade, and it involves a greater influence of multinational corporations. And one of the ways, the second point, one of the ways that multinational corporations matter is they contribute to the spread and growing importance of global supply chains. And the simple labor relations point, you don't have to be a genius to realize this, is that the expansion of global supply chains reduces worker and union relative power, right? It makes it easier for management to move production if they face higher wages in one place or request a demand for higher wages in one place. Management can move or threaten the move to another part of a global supply chain. That reduces the power of workers in that particular former site, right? At the same time, the story, as is often the case in labor relations, isn't so simple. It's not that multinational corporations are the evil force in that. At least some multinational corporations, often the larger, more established ones, actually bring higher labor standards. They bring more modern production methods. They are particularly sensitive and worried about labor rights concerns. As I'll get to, their worries derive from both their fear of bad public images and bad press. They don't want to see their company criticized in newspapers around the world. The executives don't want to be attacked and criticized. And they worry about what bad publicity about their labor practices does and will do to their profits. And then they also have their own personal moral concerns that at times matter and influence their actions. So let me talk a little bit more about how labor rights issues matter and how they've surfaced. One way is that you see pressures by NGOs, non-government organizations, including in the informal sector, bringing up labor rights concerns, raising those as political matters and using what leverage they have to try and improve the working conditions and the rights of workers, even in the informal sector. I love to emphasize that. We always think, oh, this is all going to happen in the formal sector. But in our book, we go on to describe, for example, emerging NGOs in India that represent the people who sell goods on the street, in the street markets of India. There's important new NGOs representing women who work as maids. You may have heard about some of the plight and concerns of the maids. One case we've studied is in Hong Kong, where there's a really wonderful NGO working hard to improve the working conditions of the maids, most of whom come from the Philippines and toil under very difficult circumstances. Now, what the research shows, and there's a wonderful book I'll mention in a second, the research shows that lasting and real improvements in labor conditions require and often involve an upscale, a modernization of production methods and management. It's not enough for managers to just be worried about being audited or monitored or shamed. I mean, we all kind of wish that would drive them to improve work conditions in some of those global factories. But the research has shown that for really significant improvement in work conditions, it occurs when management introduces better work conditions because it goes along with better management, where management itself sees their own interests in promoting better work practices and the associated better working conditions. And the book I was just alluding to is a wonderful book by Richard Locke called The Promise and Limits of Private Power. And Locke studies in particular what has gone on at Nike, that producer, or the seller at least, of sports equipment and sports clothes. I'll talk a little bit about Nike in a second. So if you're interested in this and want some wonderful examples and evidence from Richard Locke's research about how where we've actually seen substantive, concrete improvements in work conditions, look at his book. Okay. So let me summarize my main themes. It is that labor relations is of increasing importance in emerging countries. That's not what we always thought, in that as we've seen a persistence of global assembly lines and some difficult work conditions, many of us worried that what we might be seeing is kind of the end of labor relations, the absence of collective action or collective reaction by workers and their representatives. We've actually seen an expansion and a growth of labor relations. At the same time, we see that power still matters, and it's not so surprising there's an important role for political action in the exercise of power. We do observe that globalization pressures contribute to a deterioration of labor conditions in many sectors, but the emergence of some counter-pressures being in part the pressures of NGOs, the fear of firms or managers that they'll be criticized heavily in the press, the fear there might be consumer campaigns against their products, and as I've said, the diffusion of some more modern management practices in firms has somewhat surprisingly elevated conditions in some places. Labor rights issues are unavoidable. Whether management may dream or hope that they could go away, the central lesson of our research is that they are there to stay and cannot be avoided. They must be addressed. The collective pressures that we see are not just from traditional trade unions where we thought those pressures would arise. They increasingly come from NGOs, from consumer pressure campaigns, from rights groups, women's rights groups, immigrant rights groups, farmer rights groups, laborer rights groups, and also from independent unions that are distinguished from the previously state-dominated unions. The bottom line, as I see it and my co-authors see it on worker rights, is the glass is, we have an expression, half full, but also half empty. The glass is half empty in that very poor work conditions persist in many countries. We had a reminder of that just a few years ago when there was the tragic collapse of a building in Bangladesh. It was called the Rana Plaza building, where more than 1,000 workers, nearly all of them were women, were killed working under very difficult, harsh conditions in a garment factory, and the building collapsed and killed nearly all of the workers in that factory. And there's many other factories. That's just one example. There are factory fires, there's other factory collapses, and there's just also continuing very difficult, harsh work conditions in much of the global assembly line, as it's called. At the same time, the glass is half full. There are some signs of improvement in work conditions. Again, referring to Rick Locke's work and others' work, where there's an upscale in production management, where there's modern management being adopted. And the other aspect, I just wanted also to convey this, that other economists have been looking at, but it's just a reminder to us all, is at the same time there still are extremely difficult, harsh work conditions in many parts of the globe. Over the last 20 years, we've also experienced a substantial amount of economic growth in many parts of the developing or emerging world, and that has raised living standards in many countries. In some sense, you have, again, like the image of half full, half empty story. On the one hand, average living conditions have gone up in many countries. They were stalled, again, defying what everyone had expected in the earlier period. Economists had expected, this continuing economic growth that was going to propel things, and for a number of years, growth seemed to be stalled in the developing world. Well, in many countries, there has been substantial growth. At the same time, we see in a number of those factories you all know about, I'm referring to, sort of very harsh, difficult work conditions persisting. Both are continuing. And then the last point I'll make, and then I'll stop, is that due process continues to matter. I haven't been able to go on and explain in much detail how it matters, but what we observe through the case studies we analyze in our book in China, India, in Brazil, and South Africa, is a continuing need, continuing pressure for worker voice on the shop floor, and voice more broadly in society. And much of labor relations is about the conditions under which workers express their demands for voice, and the circumstances through which management in some places provides that voice. And what labor relations is about is essentially that question of not only whether the basic work conditions, wages and safety will be improved, but also whether the firm and society will find ways to provide workers with the voice those workers are seeking. Thank you very much.